The U.S. women's national team is making fools of themselves yet again by arguing in their closing written arguments that the court's dismissal of their equal pay lawsuit was flatly wrong. So if you don't know anything about the situation, the U.S. women's national team is suing U.S. Soccer Federation over unequal pay. Meanwhile, they're actually getting paid more than the men, and they were offered the same contract as the men, and they declined. And they negotiated a different deal. And now they're butthurt about it, even though they're still getting paid more. They're arguing that their base salary is lower than the men's, which it is, but the women have all these different benefits that the men don't have, and with those and their performance, they've been getting paid more than the men have. But they're just completely ignoring that and going with this narrative that they're getting unequal pay and getting paid less. But let's see what they're arguing now. This is an article from ESPN by Caitlin Murray. This is just recapping what I just went over. So we're going to start here. Now, in their final brief filed Friday in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the U.S. Women's National Team says an appeal granted earlier this month in another case demonstrates why the judge was wrong to dismiss their case in the first place. In that case, a woman named Tracy Sempowich sued for wage discrimination because although she had been paid the same commission rate as her male colleagues, her base pay was lower. A judge dismissed her case citing higher total compensation than her colleagues, but the appeals court overturned it. She had been paid more because she made more sales, the court said. But the rate of pay was lower, and, quote, an employer violates the Equal Pay Act if it pays female employees a rate less than that of similarly situated male employees. I don't know anything about this case other than this paragraph here, but I'm assuming they're in the same work environment, doing this exact same thing at the same level, and she got paid less base salary, and she was not offered what the men got. But that's completely different than what the U.S. Women's National Team is arguing here. They got the same offer as the men, they declined it, now they're getting paid more with a different deal with all these benefits the men don't have. So, that other stuff matters compared to this, where it seems like she didn't even get offered that same base salary as the men for doing the same thing. I'm going to get a little more into that with these arguments. According to the U.S. Women's National Team's legal team, this proves that comparing total compensation between U.S. Women's National Team and U.S. Men's National Team is legally insufficient to determine whether discrimination happened. Every court of appeals that has considered a total compensation approach by the Equal Pay Act has rejected it, the U.S. Women's National Team brief says. The U.S. Women's National Team briefs adds, here, based on this district court used a total compensation standard, it completely ignored the fact that the players' pay depends on performance. The only way the women could achieve the same overall pay as men was by performing much better than the men. That is not equal pay for equal work. Yes, but going back here for a second, you're saying it doesn't matter the other stuff that's in their contract as opposed to the men's contract, that they're not getting paid as much, but it does, because her stuff other than the base pay was the same as the men, it seems. If she's getting paid less base salary than the men doing the same thing and have the same contract otherwise, then that's an issue there. This case, they got offered that, they rejected it, negotiated another contract, they're still getting paid more, and they have different benefits and everything the men don't have, so that isn't the same thing at all. You can't compare these. U.S. Soccer, anticipating that U.S. Women's National Team side would raise the Sempowich case, issued a letter to the court last week arguing that it doesn't apply to this lawsuit because the Fourth Circuit was not asked to evaluate different compensation structures akin to U.S. national teams. Bonuses aside, the men are paid on a per-camp basis, whereas the women are paid on a hybrid structure, where some players are paid based on call-ups, others are paid salaries. In the men's contract, they got higher base salary because they don't have those benefits, and they bet on themselves to get certain incentives that women don't have because they didn't want to bet on themselves, they wanted these benefits. So to compensate for all those benefits women are getting, they're lowered the salary because they can't afford to have the same salary and all those benefits. Otherwise, the men would have a case here. And yet the women are still getting paid more. So this is completely different. The Fourth Circuit did not and had no reason to consider highly complex negotiated pay packages of the sort of issue here, i.e., where no single wage component differs between men and women while all else remains the same, U.S. Soccer said in Thursday's letter. Yeah, so they're saying what I assumed about the last case, everything else was the same but the base salary, when the base salary should have been equal. That's not even close to the same thing. The U.S. Women's National Team pushed back against the notion that different structures are relevant in its brief on Friday. However, the U.S. Women's National Team brief says U.S. Soccer wants a court to decide that, quote, if women and men's pay structures have some differences, a court should assume the differences offset each other and compare total compensation rather than rates of pay. Basically what they're saying there is just look at the base salaries, ignore everything else. That is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just ignore everything else and have tunnel vision on the base salary and just ignore the differences in the contracts and that they were offered the same contract and they rejected it. That is absurd to argue. That made-up rule is wrong, the brief adds. A court does not just throw up its hands and refuse to compare rates when there are some differences in pay structures. No, they looked at the rates, they looked at how the contracts were negotiated, how they declined the offer for this equal pay, and all the different things in the contract they got versus what the men have. They didn't just refuse to look at base pay. So basically their whole argument, this entire lawsuit, is ignore everything else and have tunnel vision for the base salary. Not to mention they want to keep everything else they have in the contract and just increase the base salary so they get paid even more than the men. That's absolutely insane for the U.S. Soccer Federation to even consider. The fact that they're trying to take this to a court is laughable. And by the way, a YouTuber called Nate the Lawyer has a breakdown of their contracts and what's in which contract and the arguments that they've made in court. So I highly recommend that video. I'll link it in the description. It goes way more in depth than I'm going in right now. I highly recommend it. Again, the U.S. Women's National Team lawyers argue that although the women negotiated for a different pay structure than the men, that does not mean they even wanted the pay structure they received. Women asked for equal pay, the brief says, but U.S. Soccer refused. And what they mean there is equal base salary with everything else they currently have, which would give them way more than the men. So then the men would have a case. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And even if they didn't want the pay structure they received, they agreed to it. They negotiated for it. So you sign the contract. You can't just take it to court and now say, well, now we don't want it. You can't do that. You just absolutely can't do that. The U.S. Women's National Team brief also cites recent events to argue that U.S. Soccer cannot, quote, claim it is impossible to provide equal World Cup bonuses. That's because U.S. Soccer has announced it wants to equalize prize money going forward, and as recently as last week touted a joint meeting between the Federation and both national teams to discuss it. In September, U.S. Soccer President Cindy Parlow Cone issued a letter in which she called on teams to negotiate a joint proposal, quote, that equalizes World Cup prize money between the U.S. men's national team and U.S. women's national team. To be able to do that, you'd have to dramatically decrease the World Cup bonus for the men to compensate for equal bonuses. The men are getting $440 million. At least that's proposed. And women are getting 60, I think, proposed, at least. I'm not sure if it's agreed to or not. But that's because men get much higher ratings in the World Cup. It's not just about the U.S., it's about the world. Even if the women here in the U.S., U.S. women, are getting higher ratings than the men in the World Cup, that doesn't mean they're getting it throughout the world. Throughout the world, the men get way higher ratings and bring in way more money. That's why they have way higher World Cup bonuses. So to provide equal bonuses, they'd have to dramatically decrease the bonuses for the men. Otherwise, if they just gave the women $440 million, they go bankrupt. It's absolutely absurd to think that they'd be able to get $440 million. The U.S. Women's National Team's brief said U.S. Soccer is trying to, quote, make the case seem as complicated as possible in lieu of providing legal justification for why the judge's original dismissal was right. The Federation wants to talk about anything other than the district court's decision, the U.S. Women's National Team brief says. Not trying to make this as complicated as possible. It might be complicated for you because you're dumb, but all they're doing is showing that, again, women negotiated a different contract. They declined the same contract as the men, and they negotiated this one. So now go back on that and sue them over it is absolutely absurd. The judge hearing the initial lawsuit, R. Gary Klausner, dismissed the U.S. Women's National Team's case based on parts on U.S. Soccer Analysis, which showed the U.S. Men's National Team was paid $212,639 per game. The U.S. Women's National Team was paid $220,747 in the period covered by the lawsuit. But the U.S. Women's National Team challenged that logic Friday, calling it, quote, happenstance that the women ended up earning slightly more per game than the men. That only happened because women won an unprecedented number of games, including back-to-back World Cups, the U.S. Women's National Team brief states. In fact, when they filed the complaint in this lawsuit, the women had earned less total compensation per game than men over the class period. And while the lawsuit was pending, women won World Cup, pushing their average per game pay above the men's. Well, that may be true, but the incentives and the benefits are covering for that base pay, that lower base pay. That's why it's lower. If you didn't have those benefits and accepted that other contract, you have the exact same amount. Analysis has shown per game average of pay for each team is highly dependent on World Cup bonuses. If the men had qualified for 2018 World Cup but lost every game, their per game average pay would have exceeded the women. The U.S. Women's National Team raises similar analysis. If they hadn't won the World Cup in 2019, their per game average pay would be lower than the U.S. Men's National Team. Up next, the case is expected to proceed with oral arguments, so this isn't the end. And the court has indicated those could start as soon as March, so this might be a while before we find out what happens in this case. But both the women and men have incentives for performance, and the women got a lot of theirs, men didn't meet a lot of theirs. That's how it works. I don't know what you're trying to argue here. That's how incentives work. If men outperform the women, they make more because they met those incentives women didn't. And women, in this case, outperformed the men. They got those incentives and the men didn't. I don't... There's no argument there. So they're making all this argument in court about wanting equal pay. Meanwhile, this is from September 14th, 2021, a few months ago. U.S. Soccer offers men's, women's team identical contract proposals. And the women rejected it and called it a publicity stunt. I have it highlighted here. It says, while the women's union also didn't immediately respond for a request to comment, in response to Cohen's open letter, U.S. Women's National Team Players Association Executive Director Becca Rowe said, it's simply false that in past negotiations, the Federation offered the Women's National Team the exact same contract. That is bullshit. They did. That's just a flat-out lie. If the USSF was serious about equal pay, they would not engage in publicity stunts, which fall short of addressing our issues. How does that fall short of addressing your issues? They're offering equal pay, and you're just declining it. It falls short of addressing your issues because you want all those benefits, everything you have with that base salary, which would mean that you get paid way more than the men. That's not how contracts work. You negotiated this. You don't have the same base salary because you get these benefits and the men don't. That's it. For you to keep the same contract you have and then increase the base pay would be utterly insane for USSF to do. And then the men would have a case to get those benefits. Obviously, they wouldn't get the same ones because some of those benefits are basically pregnancy stuff and women exclusive stuff that the men don't deal with. Meaning the base pay might go up for them again, and then we just have this cycle. It's absolutely insane. But if the court rules in favor of the women's national team, then it's just purely political and not. This is about power and greed for the women. They have to know that what they're doing is complete bullshit, and that they're getting paid more because the court ruled it. They have to know that, or just completely ignorant to it. So this is just about power over the USSF to get whatever they want. Like the NBA, the players have power over the NBA, all over the executives. But in that case, the commissioner, Adam Silver, just willingly gave it up. Willingly let the players do whatever they want. And it's destroying the league, essentially. It's absolutely ridiculous what they're doing. And the court didn't fall for it before, and I don't think they're going to fall for it this time either. But once that decision comes down, I'll be reporting it here, most likely, if I'm still doing this, which probably will. So let me know what you think about all this. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, comment, share. I have another channel called The Thoughtful Outlaw where I talk about news in the entertainment world regarding Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, gaming, and more. So check that out, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.